Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty fascinating framework found hidden inside ancient biblical texts, all about authority. Often when we think about historical structures of leadership, we immediately picture this rigid, top-down hierarchy. The one, a pyramid where the person sitting at the very top holds absolutely all the cards. But when you look closely at these specific source materials, they actually outline something much, much more dynamic. They describe what we can really best understand as a deeply interconnected, vibrant spiritual ecosystem. It's a system built entirely on checks, balances, and mutual accountability. So we're going to break down exactly how this ecosystem functions, looking right at the texts that map it all out.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're unpacking this ecosystem in 5 quick parts today. The weight of personal choice, honoring faithful leadership, strict boundaries for leaders, unity through diverse gifts, and the mandate for discernment.
All right, starting off with part 1, the weight of personal choice.
This is the very first counterweight in our ecosystem, and it establishes the inescapable foundational responsibility of the individual. In this framework, you literally cannot talk about authority without first talking about personal agency. According to Romans 14, personal accountability is the absolute starting point. Just notice the phrasing there. Each of us will give an account of himself. Basically, in this system, you don't get to just stand behind a leader or hide behind an institution when the time comes to answer for your actions. The text neutrally establishes that you, the individual, are the primary unit of accountability.
To really drive this home, the source material points to some pretty stark historical examples. Take Exodus 32, for instance. The people blindly follow Aaron's flawed leadership and build a golden calf. The result? Well, the text notes that the Lord struck the people with a plague for what they did with the calf that Aaron made. The book of Proverbs completely echoes this, describing the ruin of someone who just ignored discipline and fell into serious trouble. What this establishes in this biblical framework is that saying, "Hey, I was just following orders," is simply not a valid excuse. Your submission is your choice, and ultimately, you own the consequences of it.
Moving right along to part 2, honoring faithful leadership.
Now, while personal accountability is paramount, this ecosystem absolutely does actively establish and honor faithful leadership. The texts in 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians instruct believers to hold hardworking leaders in the highest possible regard. But Hebrews 13 actually tells us exactly why. It says to have confidence in your leaders because they keep watch over you as those who must give an account. True leaders are honored in this ecosystem specifically because they carry a massive, heavy burden of accountability themselves. They aren't unaccountable bosses, they're heavily burdened watchmen.
And this brilliantly illustrates the built-in tension of this entire system. On one side, Hebrews 13 requires the follower's submission. But right on the exact opposite side, 1 Peter 5 strictly requires the leader to serve willingly, explicitly stating they absolutely must not lord it over the people. It's a complete mutual balance. The authority only exists legitimately when it's directly paired with service.
Which brings us to part 3, strict boundaries for leaders.
Let's shift the pendulum entirely over to the leadership side of the scale and examine the incredibly strict limits placed upon them by the text. Leaders in this framework are definitely not defined as untouchable monarchs. They're defined merely as servants of Christ who've been handed a trust. And the absolute requirement for holding that trust? You have to constantly prove faithful. The burden of proof is always on the leader to demonstrate their fidelity to the trust they've been given.
1 Peter 5 establishes very specific boundaries. Just think about this stark contrast. A faithful shepherd serves willingly and is eager to serve, while an unfaithful leader pursues dishonest gain. A faithful shepherd acts as a living example to the flock, whereas an unfaithful leader uses their position to just lord power over others. The text establishes that authority is strictly tied to these exact behavioral boundaries. If a leader crosses into that unfaithful column, they're actively violating the ecosystem's rules.
Furthermore, 1 Corinthians 4 explicitly warns against elevating human ideas. It says, "Do not go beyond what is written." So the crucial point is that the text actively prevents leaders from making their own personal opinions, rules, or visions equal to established scripture. A leader cannot just invent new demands and expect everyone to submit. Their authority is strictly confined to what is already written down.
In fact, the texts actually acknowledge just how rare this kind of selfless leadership really is. In Philippians 2, the author singles out Timothy as a rare example of someone showing genuine concern for others, noting that normally, everyone looks out for their own interests. True, selfless leadership is presented not as the default setting, but as something precious that has to be carefully identified and valued when you actually find it.
Let's jump to part 4, unity through diverse gifts.
Now, what's really interesting here is what happens when we zoom out to the community as a whole. You see this absolute decentralization of power. 1 Corinthians 12 lists all these incredibly diverse gifts: wisdom, faith, healing, distinguishing spirits, the whole shebang. The text explicitly states that the same Spirit distributes these different gifts to each one for the common good. Power, insight, and utility are not hoarded at the top by a single visionary. They're distributed across the entire body.
Because everyone holds a totally necessary piece of the puzzle, Ephesians 5 mandates the ultimate equalizer: submit to one another. This is a profound shift, guys. It creates a horizontal ecosystem of mutual submission. The leader submits to the wisdom of the community, just as the community submits to the guidance of the leader. It's a web of mutual support, rather than a vertical pyramid of power.
But this brings up a massive, highly practical question. If power and gifts are shared across the community, and personal accountability is so incredibly high, how do believers in this system actually handle bad leadership? What happens when the checks and balances fail at the top?
That leads us right to our final section, Part 5, the mandate for discernment.
This brings us to the active, totally non-negotiable requirement of this system: evaluating leadership. Take this incredible example from Acts 17. The text praises the Berean Jews for being of more noble character. Why? Because they didn't just blindly accept what they were told. They examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. These were ancient fact-checkers. They didn't even take the Apostle Paul, literally one of the most prominent leaders of the time, at his word without verifying it against the text first.
This is what we call active discernment. It's the biblical requirement to investigate teachings, enforce boundaries, and outright refuse blind obedience. In this spiritual ecosystem, discernment is the final check and balance. The follower is literally required to be a critical thinker.
And when that discernment reveals a problem, the text mandates action. 2 Thessalonians 3 tells believers to take special note of anyone disobeying established instructions and to actively separate from them. The source material actually demands strong boundaries and real consequences when leaders fail to uphold their end of the text. You aren't trapped by authority. You're explicitly commanded to evaluate it.
Let's move to and see how this builds, bringing our entire explainer full circle right back to our first point. Galatians 6 warns, "Do not be deceived. A man reaps what he sows." In the end, the ultimate bottom line of this entire ecosystem is your personal stewardship. You're going to reap what you sow, and that completely includes who you choose to follow and why you choose to follow them.
As we wrap up, the key takeaway from these source texts is crystal clear. Biblical submission absolutely isn't blind obedience. It's a heavily stewarded, incredibly active choice within a perfectly balanced ecosystem of mutual accountability. Which leaves us with a critical question to ponder as we close out today. Based on this ecosystem of accountability, how will you evaluate the authority structures you are part of right now? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.